The last thing I saw clearly was the fluorescent light above the produce section. Not the shelf I was reaching for. Not the other shoppers. Just that cold, white light, steady and indifferent, while the floor came up to meet me like it had been waiting. I didn't fall the way people fall in movies. I slid. Slowly, quietly. Like my body had simply decided it was finished standing and didn't feel the need to announce it. I remember the sound of a cartwheel, someone's shoes, a voice saying, "Ma'am, ma'am," and then nothing. I am Annika Brown. I spent 31 years building a life in this city with my husband, Louis, a business, a home, a name that meant something in Houston. I raised one son. I buried my husband 14 months ago. And on a Tuesday afternoon in the produce section of a Kroger off Highway 6, my body finally said enough. The paramedics were efficient and kind. The hospital room was the color of old paper. A nurse named Dorinda, small woman, steady hands, the kind of face that has delivered difficult news before and learned how to do it gently, told me my blood pressure had dropped to a dangerous level. She told me I was stable. She told me I needed rest. Then she told me something else. They had been trying to reach my emergency contact. My son. She said it carefully. The way you say something when you already know the answer is going to hurt. Between the emergency department, the admitting staff, 2 nursing shifts, the discharge coordinator, and the social worker who came by later, they had spent nearly a full day trying to reach him. Different departments, different people. Every time someone took over my care, they tried again. They had called him 57 times. I made her repeat it, not because I didn't hear her, because I needed the number to be real before I decided what to do with it. 57. I lay back against that flat hospital pillow and looked at the ceiling and thought about Louis. Not in a general way. I thought about something specific. The morning 3 years before he died, when I had a stomach bug so bad I couldn't lift my head. And I woke up at 7 a.m. to find him sitting in the chair beside the bed, still in his work clothes, a glass of ginger ale on the nightstand, with a napkin folded underneath it so the condensation wouldn't mark the wood. He hadn't made a sound. He was just there, the way he always was. He would have been at that Kroger before the ambulance left the parking lot. If you are watching this and you have someone in your life who shows up, who always shows up, hold them. Don't let a single ordinary day pass without telling them what that means. What time are you watching this? Tell me in the comments. I want to know I'm not talking to an empty room. That evening, a hospital social worker came by. Young woman, clipboard, kind eyes. She asked if I had someone she could contact. Someone who could come. I told her yes. I had someone. I just hadn't called them yet. She wrote something on her clipboard. I watched her write it. And somewhere between her pen moving and the door closing behind her, something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a lock turns. One quiet click. They discharged me the next morning. I did not call Franklin. I called a car service and I sat in the back seat with my purse in my lap and watched Houston move past the window the way it always does. Indifferent, busy, unbothered by what happens to any one person inside it. When the car turned onto my street, something moved through me before I could name it. A pressure, a knowing. Louis always said I had a sense for things, that I felt the shape of a situation before I could see it clearly. The car stopped in front of my house. I looked toward the garage, and I understood immediately that Louis was right. The garage door was closed. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. Not an open door, not a broken lock, not a single sign of force, just a closed door and an empty space behind it where my black SUV had sat for 11 years. Clean concrete, no oil mark, no nothing. Whoever took it had a key, knew exactly where it lived, and closed the door behind them like they owned the place. I stood there for a moment, just long enough to understand what I was looking at. Franklin still had a garage remote from years ago. He had borrowed the SUV before. Errands, airport runs, things that never seemed worth discussing. If I had come home any other day, I might have assumed he had taken it again and planned to return it later. But after 57 unanswered hospital calls, the empty space felt different. Less like borrowing, more like a message. Then I went inside. I made coffee. Not because I wanted it, because my hands needed something to do while my mind worked. Lewis's study was exactly the way he left it. I hadn't moved his desk, hadn't touched his chair, hadn't changed the angle of the lamp he always kept tilted slightly left. 14 months, and I still couldn't bring myself to rearrange a single thing he'd placed with intention. I sat down in his chair, and the leather settled around me the way it always had around him. And for one breath, the room still smelled faintly like him, cedar and something warm underneath it. If I sat very still. I opened my phone. I wasn't looking for missed calls from Franklin. I had stopped expecting anything from that direction the moment Dorinda said 57. What I was looking for was the call log the hospital printed for me before discharge. The outgoing record I'd asked Dorinda for quietly, like a woman who already knew she would need documentation and couldn't explain why yet. I found Tiffany's page instead. The post was time-stamped the previous evening, while I was still in that hospital room, still connected to monitors, still waiting for my blood pressure to stabilize. The photo was my black SUV, Tiffany behind the wheel, one hand raised toward the camera, the caption sitting underneath it like a verdict. It's all mine now. Franklin's like was the third one on the post. Not a comment, not a call to his mother lying in a hospital bed. A like, quiet and confirming, the way a man signs his name to something he's already agreed to. I stared at the screen for a long time. The empty space in the garage made sense now. And then I remembered Celestine. 8 months ago, she had called me, her voice carrying that careful weight it gets when she's about to say something she's been holding for too long. Annika, I need you to pay attention to Franklin. I had told her I was tired. I was grieving. I wasn't ready to hear anything complicated about my son. She had gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, but I'm going to keep watching." I'd said fine. I hadn't thought about it again. Until now. I set the phone face down on Lewis's desk. Then I picked it up again. I took a screenshot of the post. Then I opened my photos and screenshotted it again. Then I opened my email and sent both images to myself with the timestamp visible. I did all of this without thinking. 31 years of running a business with Lewis had made certain instincts automatic. He always said it the same way, every time a situation felt uncertain. Document first, react second. I was not reacting yet. I sat in his chair and I felt the grief in my chest do something I hadn't felt it do before. It didn't leave. Grief doesn't leave. Not really. But it shifted. Moved aside just enough to make room for something colder. Something that didn't shake. I looked at the left side of Lewis's desk. The drawer I hadn't opened since the morning after his funeral. The one I'd told myself I wasn't ready for. I opened it. Inside was a folder. His handwriting on the tab, neat and deliberate the way everything Lewis touched was neat and deliberate. For Annika, read when you're ready. I picked it up. I was ready. The folder contained 3 things: a handwritten letter folded in thirds, a copy of the Brown & Associates LLC operating agreement, 22 pages, certain provisions underlined in Lewis's deliberate hand, and a business card, cream-colored, simple, Marcus Elliott, attorney at law. On the back, in Lewis's writing, Call him if you ever need to. I set the letter aside. I would read it last. I knew that instinctively, the way you know to save the thing that will cost you the most. I set the operating agreement beside it and looked at the business card for one long moment before placing it carefully on the corner of the desk where I wouldn't lose it. Then I went to the kitchen table with my laptop and printed 18 months of bank statements. I spread them across the desk in sequence, oldest left, newest right, the way Louis and I used to lay out quarterly reports when we were reconciling the books together on Sunday evenings. The room was quiet. Outside, Houston moved through its afternoon without any awareness of what was happening inside this house. The transfers were small. That was the first thing I noticed, and it was the thing that chilled me most. Not because small amounts don't matter, but because small amounts are chosen deliberately by someone who understands how to avoid being noticed. $200, $350, once $480. Never more than $500 in a single transaction. Always on the 7th of the month and the 21st, with a consistency so clean it could only be intentional. 11 months of them, starting 3 months after Louis died. I sat with that for a moment. 3 months after the funeral, while I was still sleeping in 2-hour stretches and forgetting to eat, someone had begun quietly moving money out of an account that bore my name. The afternoon slipped away while I worked. I pulled property files from cabinets, opened folders I hadn't touched since Louis died, cross-referenced dates, followed paper trails. More than once, I had to stop and make coffee simply to keep my thoughts moving in a straight line. By the time the sunlight had shifted across the study floor, I had narrowed my attention to the Westheimer building records. Something about the operating agreement's underlined provisions kept drawing me back there. I found the document inside a manila envelope I almost missed because it was tucked behind the insurance documentation. A title transfer request on the Westheimer property. Initiated. Not completed, but initiated. With paperwork filed and a reference number assigned. Louis built that building in 1998. It was the first commercial property he ever owned outright. The initiation date on the transfer request was 7 months ago. Louis had been dead for 7 months by then. Franklin's signature was on the initiation form. I read it twice. Then I set it down and picked it up and read it again. Because there are some things your eyes pass over looking for a different answer before your mind accepts the one in front of it. The second document didn't appear until nearly an hour later. I was rechecking the operating agreement against older company records when I found it buried inside a stack of LLC paperwork. A Texas Secretary of State filing, a management amendment for Brown and Associates LLC, listing Franklin Brown as co-managing member. Louis's signature was not on it. Mine was not on it. The operating agreement Louis left in this folder required either his signature or mine for any management change to be valid. This document had neither. What it had was a filing date of 9 months ago and a notary stamp I didn't recognize. Louis used to go completely still in negotiations when someone tried to move a boundary he'd set. Not angry, still. The kind of stillness that made the other person understand, without a word being spoken, that they had made a serious miscalculation. I had watched him do it 100 times across 31 years. I felt it now in my own body, that same cold, load-bearing stillness. I picked up Marcus Elliott's business card. I looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I picked up my phone, not to scream, not to confront anyone. One call, one number Louis trusted enough to leave behind for exactly this moment. That was all. She didn't bring flowers. She didn't bring food. Celestine Marks arrived at my front door 2 days after my call with a brown accordion folder under one arm and the expression of a woman who had been waiting 8 months for permission to speak. I let her in without a word. We had known each other long enough that some entrances don't require ceremony. She sat across from me at Lewis's desk and placed the folder between us the way you place evidence, carefully, with full awareness of what it contains. Then she opened it. 7 months of documentation. Dates written in Celestine's precise handwriting. Printed emails. A photograph, taken from what looked like a car window, of Franklin walking into a title company office on Westheimer with a man neither of us recognized. A printed LinkedIn profile for a property management company called Hargrove and Associates Property Solutions, registered 4 months ago. The registered agent was listed under a name I didn't know, but the business address was a suite in a building 3 blocks from Franklin and Tiffany's house. And Hargrove was Tiffany's maiden name. I didn't speak. I looked at each document the way Lewis taught me to look at anything important, fully, without rushing toward a conclusion before the picture was complete. Celestine let me finish. Then she told me the rest. For the past 6 months, Franklin had been making quiet contact with people in Houston's commercial real estate community, men and women who had done business with Lewis for decades, who knew Brown and Associates by reputation and by relationship. He had been telling them that I was struggling, that the grief had affected my cognition, that I was having difficulty managing the properties and the business, and that he was stepping in to handle things. He said it carefully, she told me. Never as an accusation. Always as a concerned son. The kind of thing that sounds like love until you realize what it's doing. 3 of Lewis's longtime contacts had pulled back from me in the past 6 months. Stopped returning calls. Let relationships go quiet. I had told myself it was grief distance, that people sometimes didn't know what to say to a widow and so said nothing. I had given them grace for it. It wasn't grief distance. I sat with that for a moment. The specific cruelty of it, using Lewis's name and Lewis's network to dismantle the woman Lewis spent 31 years building beside. I sat with it, and I didn't let my face move. Then I asked Celestine when she started watching. She said month 2 after the funeral. I asked her why. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At the repast, after we buried Lewis, Franklin stopped calling you Mama. Every time he spoke about you to someone else in that room, he called you Annika. Not his mother, not Mama. Annika. Like you were someone he was managing instead of someone he belonged to." I understood immediately why she'd written it down. In our world. In the world Lewis and I were raised in. The world that held that repast together. A son calls his mother Mama in public until one of them is in the ground. You don't shift to her first name in a room full of people who loved her husband unless something in you has already shifted first. It was a small thing, the kind of thing only someone paying close attention would catch. Celestine had caught it and kept it and built 7 months of documentation on top of it. The last of whatever I had been holding for Franklin. The grief softened part of me that kept looking for a reason. Left quietly in that moment. Not a breaking, a closing. Like a door in a house where someone has already been gone for a long time. Celestine asked me what I was going to do. I told her I had called Marcus Elliott 2 days ago, that I had an appointment in the morning, and that I needed her to keep watching. Because what I was about to do required everything documented before Franklin had any idea I was moving. She nodded once, closed the folder, and stayed for coffee. The first thing I noticed was the photograph. It sat on the credenza behind Marcus Elliott's desk. Not a formal portrait, not a posed business shot, but a candid. Lewis and a man I now understood was Marcus, standing at what looked like a groundbreaking. Both of them caught mid-laugh at something just outside the frame. Lewis was wearing the gray jacket he saved for occasions he considered important. I hadn't seen that photograph before. I hadn't known it existed. I sat down and didn't look away from it for a long moment. Marcus let me look. He was that kind of man, measured, unhurried, the kind of stillness that comes from decades of sitting across from people in pain and knowing that rushing them costs more than waiting. When I finally moved my eyes to him, he nodded once, the way Lewis used to nod when something had been understood without needing to be said. He opened the file. The damage assessment took 20 minutes. He laid it out, instrument by instrument. The fraudulent Secretary of State filing naming Franklin as co-managing member without a valid signature. The expired power of Attorney Lewis had granted Franklin for a specific purpose in 2019 that terminated automatically at Lewis's death, used 11 months later as though it still carried force. The Westheimer title initiation. The reputational contacts. Each piece placed on the table between us with the precision of a man who had been building this picture since my call 2 days ago and wanted me to see the full shape of it before he said anything else. I asked him how a filing like that could even appear in state records without anyone stopping it. Marcus leaned back slightly. He said the Secretary of State's office processes thousands of business filings every year. Most are accepted administratively based on the information submitted. The office does not independently verify every signature or investigate internal company authority before a filing is entered into the record. When someone submits false information, the filing can appear legitimate until it is challenged and reviewed. Then he tapped the document once. That's why this matters, he said, because someone relied on the system counting on nobody looking closely. It was devastating the way confirmed suspicions always are. Not surprising, just final. I asked him how long it would have taken if I hadn't found Lewis's folder, if I'd never pulled the bank statements. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, Houston moved through its afternoon. Cranes, glass buildings, the city Lewis loved and built inside of. He said, probably 4 to 6 more months before the Westheimer transfer completed, and the damage to your professional standing became structural. Hard to reverse at that point. Then he said, Lewis knew. He didn't know Franklin would do this specifically, but he knew enough to build the protection before he died. I kept my face still. It was the hardest thing I'd done since I walked into that office. Marcus slid the operating agreement across the table. He pointed to the provision with Lewis's underline beneath it. The same underline I'd seen in the folder at home. The same deliberate mark. The LLC structure Lewis built for Brown & Associates required my written consent for any asset transfer, any management change, any property disposition. Without it, nothing Franklin had been attempting held any legal weight. Every move he had made for 11 months had been made against a wall that Lewis built before he took his last breath, specifically so it would be standing when it was needed. Franklin had been trying to take what Lewis had already made untouchable. I put my hand flat on the operating agreement. The paper was cool under my palm. I didn't cry in Marcus's office. I had made that decision before I walked in, that whatever I felt in this room, I would feel later, privately, where it belonged. Marcus told me one more thing before I stood to leave. In Texas, he said, recording law is one-party consent. Any conversation I participated in, I was legally permitted to record without informing the other party. I asked him if that included conversations in my own home. He said, especially those. I nodded once. I picked up my bag. I shook his hand and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there looking at nothing while the doors opened. I made it to the car. I sat in the driver's seat. I gave myself 60 seconds for Lewis, for the 31 years, for the photograph on that credenza, for the fact that he knew and he prepared, and he loved me with that level of specific, quiet, permanent intention. 60 seconds. Then I started the car. He brought food from Lucille's. That was the first thing that turned my stomach. Not the unannounced arrival, not the knock on the door I wasn't expecting, but the specific choice. Lucille's on Westheimer, the deli I had loved for 20 years. The one Louis and I used to stop at on Saturday mornings after the farmer's market. Franklin knew exactly what that bag meant to me. He had chosen it on purpose, the way you choose a key that fits a specific lock. I opened the door. I looked at my son standing on his father's porch with that bag in his hand and a face arranged into something that resembled concern. I let him in. I moved to the kitchen and put the kettle on. I kept my movements slow, slightly effortful, the way a woman moves when her body is still recovering. When I set his cup down, my hands held the faintest tremor, not because I was falling apart, because Franklin needed to see a version of me that confirmed the story he'd been telling everyone else. And I had decided in Marcus's parking lot 2 days ago that I would give him exactly that. He relaxed within 20 minutes. I watched it happen. The shoulders releasing, the careful politeness softening into something more comfortable, more familiar with itself. He started talking the way people talk when they believe they're the most capable person in the room. He said he'd been thinking about the properties. Just in general? He said. Just keeping an eye on things the way Louis would have wanted. He mentioned the Westheimer building specifically. Said the commercial market was shifting and it might be worth having a fresh set of eyes on the management structure. He had someone in mind, he said. A property manager named Desmond. Good reputation. Handled several buildings in the area. Could take the day-to-day pressure off me while I focused on getting my strength back. I wrapped both hands around my cup and nodded slowly. Then he said, "We." Not you should think about it. We should probably look at restructuring, not your company. We need to make sure Brown and Associates is positioned correctly going into next year. He said it the way a man says it when the transition has already completed inside his own mind, and he is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I kept my expression soft and my eyes slightly unfocused, the look of a woman who is tired and grateful for her son's help. Then he mentioned the contacts. He said he'd had some conversations. Preliminary. Nothing formal. With a few of Louis's people. Feeling out the landscape, he said. Making sure relationships were maintained. He named 2 men. I recognized both names immediately. They were 2 of the 3 contacts Celestine had identified as having quietly pulled back from me over the past 6 months. He named them with the ease of a man who had no idea I already knew why they'd gone quiet. He was sitting at Louis's kitchen table, drinking tea I had made, in a house Louis built, naming the men he had poisoned against me as though he was reporting on his own good stewardship of his father's legacy. I looked at my son and understood something completely for the first time. This was not grief doing something strange to his judgment. This was not the behavior of a man who had lost his father and lost his way. Franklin had looked at Louis's death and seen a door open, and he had been walking through it one careful step at a time for 11 months. The man across from me had planned this. He was still planning it, right now, at this table, in this house. He stayed another 40 minutes. When he left, he hugged me at the door. The long kind, the kind that looks like love from the outside. I stood at the window and watched his car until it turned the corner. Then I picked up my phone. Marcus had told me that Texas was a one-party consent state. Before Franklin arrived, I had opened the voice recorder and left it running on the kitchen counter. I pressed play. His voice came through clearly. Desmond's name. The word "we," 3 separate times. Both contact names spoken without hesitation. I locked the recording and backed it up. Then I picked up my phone again. Marcus needed to hear this tonight. Celestine called on a Thursday morning using the voice she reserves for things that cannot be unsaid. I recognized it before she finished her first sentence. Measured, careful, the voice of a woman who has decided that what she's carrying is too heavy to carry alone any longer. She asked if I was sitting down. I was already at Lewis's desk. I told her yes. She started 8 months back. When she first began watching Franklin, she had mentioned her concerns, carefully, without specifics, to a colleague named Vivian. Retired now, but 30 years as a family law paralegal in Houston's legal community had left Vivian with a network that ran deeper than most active attorneys. Celestine had not asked her to investigate. She had simply said, "I'm watching a situation, and something feels wrong." Vivian had listened without interrupting, said she'd think on it. 3 weeks later, Vivian called back. What she had found, gathered quietly through her own contacts, passed to Celestine with the clear understanding it would go no further than necessary. Was this: before she was Tiffany Brown, she was Tiffany Hargrove, raised in Beaumont, briefly married in her late 20s to a man whose family owned commercial property in Jefferson County. The marriage lasted 14 months. Some of the records were incomplete. Some had been sealed as part of later settlement agreements. Vivian could not verify every detail independently, but enough documentation remained: property records, attorney correspondence references, and county filings connected to the dispute, to establish the broad outline of what happened. The dispute was not identical to what was happening in Houston. That was the first thing Vivian emphasized. There had been no Secretary of State filing, no company management amendment, no paper trail that mirrored what Franklin was attempting now. What remained in the records instead was a series of questions. During the marriage, one commercial property had been transferred out of the elderly mother's name under circumstances later challenged by the family. A disputed lien appeared against a second property and was eventually removed after attorneys became involved. According to surviving correspondence, the mother maintained she did not fully understand the documents she had been asked to sign. The family's attorneys disagreed with how the transactions had occurred. Litigation was threatened. Settlement discussions followed. Eventually, the transfers were reversed. The lien disappeared. The marriage ended. No criminal charges were filed. The matter was resolved quietly. I didn't speak for a long moment after Celestine finished. Then I asked her, "The mother in Beaumont? Was she a widow?" Celestine said yes. I asked, "And the son? Was he the one who introduced Tiffany into the family?" Celestine said yes. I set that down in my mind the way you set something fragile on a hard surface, carefully, making sure it doesn't shatter before you've had the chance to understand its full shape. Maybe Beaumont wasn't proof. Maybe it wasn't even a pattern in the legal sense, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. Twice Tiffany had entered a family through a son. Twice she had found herself near commercial property controlled by an older widowed mother. Twice attorneys eventually became involved. That was not evidence of guilt, but it was no longer something I could dismiss as coincidence either. Celestine mentioned one more thing. Vivian's contact in Beaumont had noted that Tiffany's father, Gerald Hargrove, retired, still living in Beaumont, had severed contact with his daughter sometime after the marriage ended. He had not attended Franklin and Tiffany's Houston wedding. He had not been to their home. He had sent a card. A father who sent a card to his own daughter's wedding. I told Celestine to find me Gerald Hargrove's contact information. I didn't know yet whether I would use it, but I wanted it in my hand. After we hung up, I sat at Lewis's desk for exactly 1 minute. Then I called Marcus. I told him about Beaumont, about the prior marriage, the disputed property issues, the attorneys, the quiet resolution, the father who sent a card. There was a pause on his end. Not surprise, something more deliberate than that. The pause of a man recalculating the weight of what he's building. Then Marcus said, "That changes the scope of what we file." The call came on a Monday morning while I was at Lewis's desk reviewing leasing records. Mrs. Okafor, 9 years in the ground floor commercial space of my Westheimer building, a seamstress whose alterations business had outlasted 3 recessions and 2 floods, spoke carefully, the way a person speaks when they're not sure if they're about to cause trouble or prevent it. She said a woman had contacted her the previous week. The woman identified herself as the new property manager for Brown & Associates. She said all future rent payments and maintenance requests should be directed to her going forward. She left a number. Mrs. Okafor wrote it down. Then she sat with it for several days. Something felt wrong, she said. She couldn't name it precisely. Just that in 9 years of leasing from us, nobody had ever contacted her to redirect payments without a letter from Lewis first, and then from me after Lewis passed. She decided to call me directly before she did anything else. I asked her for the number. She read it to me. I already knew it before she finished. It was the same number Celestine had found attached to the property management company registered 4 months ago under Tiffany's maiden name, Hargrove and Associates Property Solutions. The same company, the same number. Tiffany had called my tenant directly and told her that Brown & Associates now had new management. I kept my voice level. I told Mrs. Okafor that I was the property manager of that building and I always would be, and absolutely nothing had changed. I thanked her for calling me first. Then I asked her to save our call in her phone log and to keep the number the woman had left. She said she would. I called Marcus before I set the phone down. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "She just handed us tortious interference." His tone had the quality of a man who has been building a case carefully and just watched the other side make an unforced error. He drafted the cease and desist that afternoon. By end of business, it had been delivered, physically, by courier, to Tiffany's personal address and to the registered business address of Hargrove and Associates Property Solutions. Franklin called that evening at 7:43. He did not begin with concern. He began with control. The particular anger of a man who has decided that what he's feeling is reasonable and that I am the one causing the problem. He said I was being difficult. Said I was making something simple unnecessarily complicated. Said Desmond was trying to help and I was treating good intentions like an attack. Then he said, "All Tiffany was trying to do was take something off your plate." He had just told me he knew about Tiffany's call to Mrs. Okafor before I said a word about it. I had not mentioned Mrs. Okafor. I had not mentioned Tiffany's contact. He knew because he had been part of it. They had moved together, coordinated, and his anger had made him careless enough to confirm it on a line he did not know was recording. He kept talking. I let him. I said almost nothing. Small sounds of acknowledgement, the kind that keep a person speaking because they mistake silence for agreement. When he finally finished, I said, "I hear you, Franklin." That was all. He took it as submission. I could hear it in the way his breathing settled, the way his voice lost its edge. He said he'd talk to me soon and ended the call. I sat in the quiet for a moment. Lewis used to say that a man who believes he's already won will tell you everything you need. He had been right about that the same way he'd been right about most things. I picked up my phone and texted Marcus 3 words. He confirmed it. His response came back in under a minute. "I'll prepare the filing." Marcus called on a Wednesday morning. I recognized the quality in his voice before he said anything of substance. Measured, deliberate. The particular care of a man who has news that lands on both sides of the ledger and wants to deliver it correctly. He said, "Franklin's attorney called me this morning." I set down my coffee and waited. Franklin's legal team had spent the days since the cease and desist trying to understand exactly what they were working with. Standard procedure. Before you respond to a legal action, you map the landscape. Identify the assets in question. Understand the structure you're dealing with. So they pulled the Brown and Associates LLC documentation. They reviewed the operating agreement. They looked for the pathway Franklin had been certain existed, the one that would give him legal standing to the Westheimer property, the other commercial holdings, the operating accounts, the business itself. At first, Marcus said, they appeared to believe there might be room for an argument, a procedural issue, an ambiguity, some avenue that could be negotiated. They didn't find it. What they found instead was the wall Lewis built. The operating agreement's managing member provisions were airtight, drafted specifically, Marcus told me, with language that closed every standard avenue of challenge. No asset transfer, no management amendment, no property disposition. Nothing moved within Brown and Associates without my written consent, not Franklin's consent, not a co-managing member's consent, because Franklin was not, and had never been, a co-managing member regardless of what his fraudulent Secretary of State filing claimed. That filing had no legal force. It never had. The operating agreement Lewis put in place years earlier had been designed to protect the company from unauthorized action, regardless of who attempted it. Franklin simply happened to be the person running into it. Franklin's attorney had called Marcus with the tone, Marcus said, of a man doing arithmetic in real time and not liking the sum. Professional. Attorneys stay professional. But the recalibration was audible underneath the courtesy. He had asked whether there was any possibility of a negotiated resolution. Marcus told him he would relay the inquiry. I told Marcus there was nothing to relay. There was no negotiated resolution that included Franklin touching Brown and Associates in any capacity. What I wanted, what I had decided the moment I gave Marcus the word to file, was accountability. Full and documented accountability. For the fraudulent Secretary of State filing. For the expired power of attorney used as a live instrument against my accounts for 3 months. For the systematic damage to my professional standing in a community Lewis spent 30 years building our name inside. For Tiffany calling my tenant and redirecting my rent. All of it. Every instrument. Every move. Marcus said he understood. Then he said one more thing. Franklin's attorney had asked, carefully, almost as an aside, whether Tiffany would be named as a separate party in the anticipated civil filing. Not Franklin's exposure. Not the marital assets, Tiffany's individual legal exposure, specifically and separately. I sat with that for a moment. A husband's attorney asking about his wife's separate liability is not the question of a unified defense. It is the question of a man who has been told to assess every risk, including the risk sitting across the breakfast table. Franklin's own attorney was already drawing a line between Franklin's interests and Tiffany's. Whether Franklin knew that line was being drawn was a different question entirely. I processed all of it from Lewis's desk, from the same chair, the same distance I had maintained since the morning I came home and found the garage empty. I was not watching Franklin's world come apart in real time. I was being informed of it quietly, from across the city, by a man Lewis had trusted. That distance was not coldness. That distance was the whole point. I asked Marcus when we could file. He said the civil suit was ready. He was waiting only for my word. I gave it. The preservation notice went out on a Thursday morning. Marcus's paralegal filed it with the platform before 9 a.m. A formal legal instrument requiring the company to preserve and produce the post in its original form, with all metadata intact, timestamp, location data, account information. Every digital fingerprint Tiffany had left on the night she sat somewhere in Houston, while I was still connected to hospital monitors, and posted a photograph of my company vehicle with a caption that told everyone exactly what she believed was already hers. The screenshots I had taken in Lewis's study, 2 of them, emailed to myself within minutes of finding the post, timestamps embedded, became Exhibit A in a Harris County District Court filing. Tiffany's vanity, preserved in the exact moment she expressed it, was now a legal instrument. The instinct Lewis had built into me over 31 years, document first, react second, had turned a social media post into the foundation of a case. Marcus called me that afternoon. Tiffany's attorney had contacted his office within 48 hours of the cease and desist and the preservation notice arriving together. He described the attorney's tone the way he described most things, precisely, without editorializing. Someone who has just seen the complete picture for the first time and has realized the picture is significantly worse than their client indicated. The attorney had requested time. Marcus walked me through what Tiffany's attorney was now looking at. Tortious interference from the Mrs. Okafor contact. Unauthorized possession of a company vehicle. The post as documented evidence of intent. She had published it the same evening I was hospitalized, establishing timing and context. The recordings, the property management activity, the broader pattern of conduct already documented in Houston. The Beaumont matter might be referenced, Marcus said, but only as background, not as proof of what happened here. The Houston record stood on its own. I found that oddly comforting. I didn't need another family's story to explain mine. I asked Marcus what his read was on Tiffany. He said, she doesn't believe it yet. I understood that immediately. A person who has operated without real consequence for a long time develops a particular kind of certainty, not arrogance exactly, but a deep structural confidence that the architecture of a situation will bend toward them the way it always has. Tiffany was still inside that confidence, still turning the problem over in her mind, looking for the angle that would make it manageable, still certain that somewhere in this situation there was an exit she hadn't found yet. Then Marcus told me something that shifted the picture. Tiffany's attorney had asked him a specific question, careful, almost offhand, the kind of question an attorney asks when they already know the answer will matter. She had asked whether the civil filing would reference the Beaumont matter specifically, by name, by detail. I sat with that. Tiffany's attorney knew about Beaumont because Tiffany had told her. An attorney doesn't ask about a prior dispute in another city unless their client has disclosed it, which meant that beneath the performance of confidence, beneath the attorney asking for time and extensions and negotiated accommodations, Tiffany had sat across from her own lawyer and explained Beaumont because she understood that it might surface and wanted to know how much it mattered. She was not as certain as she appeared. 31 years of negotiations with Lewis had shown me exactly what a frightened person looks like when they are still performing composure. The asks for time, the careful questions that reveal more than they conceal. The attorney positioned between her client's fear and the other side's preparation. Tiffany was frightened, and a frightened Tiffany still searching for the exit she believed existed was both more dangerous and more useful than a confident one. I told Marcus to move forward on schedule, no extensions, no accommodations, no delays of any kind. The civil filing would be in Harris County District Court when Marcus said it would be there. I was done waiting. The number was a 409 area code, Beaumont. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the screen for 2 full seconds, long enough to consider, not long enough to decide against it. I answered. The man on the other end spoke before I could say anything beyond hello. He said, "Mrs. Brown, my name is Gerald Hargrove. I am Tiffany's father. I know who you are." His voice was slow and deliberate, not hesitant, deliberate. The voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he had decided to say exactly what was true, and truth doesn't require rehearsal. It only requires courage. I said nothing. Lewis taught me that in every conversation that matters, the person who speaks first reveals the most. I waited. Gerald talked for a long time, He told me about the woman in Beaumont, not her name, he kept that, but enough for me to understand. A widow. 67 years old when Tiffany entered her family through her son's front door. A woman who had spent decades building commercial property with her husband and managing it after he died. Gerald said he watched certain things happen that made him uncomfortable. Nothing dramatic at first. Small things. Questions about ownership. Questions about documents. Questions about property that seemed unusually specific for someone newly married into the family. He said Tiffany had always possessed a particular quality, a precision in how she moved through situations, a way of identifying what people valued most and positioning herself near it. For years, he called it ambition. Then, attorneys became involved. Property disputes followed. The marriage ended. And Gerald stopped calling it ambition. He said he chose quiet when everything was over. Not because he believed nothing had happened, because Tiffany was still his daughter, because he wanted to believe she would learn from it. He said, "I was wrong. I have been living inside that wrongness for 4 years." When a colleague forwarded him a professional newsletter several weeks earlier referencing litigation connected to Brown and Associates, he recognized Louis Brown's name immediately. He knew Louis's reputation. He knew what kind of man Louis had been. And he knew enough about Beaumont to become uncomfortable all over again. So he started making calls. Not to reopen Beaumont. Just to understand whether the two situations were actually connected. What he learned convinced him they might be. I listened. The thing that struck me wasn't certainty. It was the absence of certainty. Gerald wasn't claiming to know everything. He wasn't trying to prove a case. He sounded like a man who had spent years wishing he had paid closer attention. Then he told me something useful. The Beaumont family's attorneys had handled most of the records when the matter was resolved. He personally did not have complete files. What he had were a handful of retained documents, old correspondence, and enough information to identify the attorneys involved if Marcus wanted to request records or verify details. That felt real. A man keeping a few papers, not a secret archive, not a perfect file cabinet waiting 4 years for a phone call, just enough to point in the right direction. I thought about Louis. I thought about what he would have said to this man. A father sitting somewhere in Beaumont carrying 4 years of regret and finally deciding to stop carrying it alone. I thought Louis would have said, "Thank you for calling." I asked Gerald if he would be willing to have his attorney speak with Marcus Elliott. He said, "Absolutely." I thanked him. The call ended. I sat in Louis's chair without moving for a long time, long enough for the room to go from afternoon light to something quieter, longer than I had sat still since the morning I came home from the hospital and found the garage empty. 2 parents, 1 catastrophe, and a man who had finally run out of reasons to stay silent. The filing went into Harris County District Court on a Tuesday morning at 9:47. By 2 in the afternoon, it was public record. The filing was 41 pages. Marcus had been thorough in the way that Louis was thorough. Nothing left to interpretation. Nothing that required assumption. Franklin Brown and Tiffany Brown, named individually and jointly. The fraudulent Secretary of State filing. The expired power of attorney deployed as a live instrument against my accounts. Tortious interference with an existing lease agreement. Unauthorized possession of a company vehicle. Documentation supporting concerns of financial exploitation while I was hospitalized and recovering. And attached separately as background material. Information connected to the earlier Beaumont property dispute, included not as proof of what happened in Houston, but as context Marcus believed might become relevant if questions about intent or pattern later arose. 41 pages, every instrument, every move, every month. Houston did not react immediately. The first day passed quietly. The second was quieter than I expected. Then, sometime toward the end of the week, the calls began. People talk in business communities, not loudly, not all at once. Information moves from office to office, lunch meeting to lunch meeting, attorney to attorney. A filing becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes a question. Then, eventually, someone picks up a phone. The first call came from a number I recognized, then another, then another. People who had gone quiet in the past 6 months. People I had given the grace of grief distance without understanding what their silence actually meant. They were calling now. It wasn't because the legal details were dramatic. It was because of the name at the center of them. Lewis Brown had built things in this city for 30 years. His name was on the donor recognition wall at a community hospital on the southwest side, where he had written a check without being asked during a capital campaign 15 years ago. His name was on the cornerstone of the Westheimer building, placed there in 1998 when he broke ground on the first commercial property he had ever owned outright. People in Houston's business community knew that name, the way you know a landmark, not always consciously, but immediately when it appears somewhere it shouldn't. Lewis Brown's name on a civil filing in Harris County, attached to his own son's actions, was not something that passed without notice. 2 of his longtime business contacts called me before the week was over. Both men were careful. Attorneys had likely advised everyone in Houston's business community to be careful about what they said in connection with an active filing. But they called. One of them said simply that he wanted me to know he was thinking of me. The other said he should have returned my calls sooner and that he was sorry he hadn't. Neither man explained why he had gone quiet for 6 months. Neither man needed to. Franklin had spent 11 months using his father's name to suggest that I was diminished, that Lewis's death had left me incapable, that the woman Lewis built beside him for 31 years had somehow become less of herself without him. What he had actually done, without understanding it, was remind everyone who knew Lewis exactly whose name it was and exactly what it stood for. Lewis's name was protecting me again. From the grave, the same as always. I sat with that for a long time, not with satisfaction, with grief, the specific grief of a necessary thing. Lewis's family name was in a courthouse. His son's wrongdoing was attached to it in 41 pages of documented fact. This was not what I had wanted for this name. This was not what Lewis had worked 30 years to build toward. But there are moments when the only way to protect something is to bring it into the light and let the light do what darkness couldn't. And this was one of those moments. I had done what needed doing. I knew it the way you know a hard decision that was right, not with joy, with the quiet of something settled. I called Marcus before I went to bed. I told him I wanted a copy of the filing sent to the Texas Attorney General's White-Collar Crime Division, the fraudulent Secretary of State documentation specifically. I wanted official eyes on it beyond the civil court. Marcus said, "I already sent it this afternoon." I thought you'd want that. I looked at the phone for a moment. I said, "Lewis would have liked you." There was a pause. Then Marcus said quietly, "He did." Marcus called on a Friday morning with news that arrived in layers. Several weeks had passed since the civil filing. The Texas Attorney General's White-Collar Crime Division had opened a preliminary inquiry into the fraudulent Secretary of State filing. Not a full criminal investigation. Not yet. A review. Someone in that office was now sitting with the same documents Marcus had filed, looking at Franklin's name on a management amendment that bore no valid signature, and asking the questions that official reviews are designed to ask. Marcus explained the distinction carefully. A review was not an indictment, but a review meant that the filing had crossed a threshold of concern serious enough for the state to look at it with its own eyes. I told him I understood. I asked him what came next. He said, We wait and let it move. Over the weeks following the civil filing, Marcus received formal notification that Franklin and Tiffany had retained separate legal counsel. Franklin had kept his original attorney, the same man who had called Marcus after discovering the LLC wall, the same voice that had asked about negotiated resolutions. Tiffany had retained a different firm entirely. A different firm with a different address and a different area of specialization. One that Marcus noted, without editorializing, handled a significant volume of cooperation-related criminal defense work. I sat with that information the way I had learned to sit with everything in the past several weeks. Fully, without rushing toward the conclusion before the shape was complete. Separate attorneys meant separate interests. A husband and wife operating as a unified defense retained one attorney, or coordinated two so closely they functioned as one. A husband and wife who retained separate counsel from different firms had made a private calculation, each one, alone, looking at the landscape and determining that their individual survival might require a different strategy than their joint one. What that calculation would ultimately produce, I didn't know. But I knew it meant they were no longer moving through this situation as a single unit. That mattered. I thought about Franklin then. Not about what he had done. I had finished processing that weeks ago. I thought about what he could have been. Lewis used to take him to job sites on Saturday mornings when he was small, before the business had grown large enough to require proper safety protocols, back when a father could walk his boy through a construction site and let him touch things and ask questions. Franklin would wear Lewis's hard hat, enormous on his small head, tilted forward over his eyes. He asked questions about everything: what that beam was for, why that wall went there, how you knew where to put the foundation. He was genuinely curious, genuinely interested. Lewis used to come home from those Saturdays with a particular kind of satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. Somewhere between those Saturday mornings and now, Franklin had chosen a different direction. I didn't know the exact moment. I had stopped looking for it. But I let myself feel the weight of that distance between the boy in the hard hat and the man on the recorded line saying "we" for exactly as long as it took me to walk from Marcus's office to the elevator. Then Marcus told me the last thing. Tiffany's new attorney had recently made informal contact with the AG's office. Preliminary, exploratory, the kind of contact that doesn't commit to anything but signals clearly that a conversation is available. Someone was beginning to evaluate options, what cooperation might cost, what it might buy, and whether maintaining a united front remained in their client's best interest. I was not satisfied by this. Satisfaction would have been simple, and this was not simple. What I felt was the particular weight of a thing that has been set in motion and no longer needs your hand to keep moving. My job now was to stay steady, to let it complete. Marcus asked how I was holding up. I said, "I'm holding." He said that was what mattered. I drove home. I sat at Lewis's desk. I looked at his photograph for a long time. Marcus called on a Thursday morning. His voice carried something I hadn't heard in it before. Not excitement, not relief. Something quieter than both. Settled. The quality of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just set it down on solid ground. He said, "Tiffany's cooperation agreement was executed this morning." I didn't speak immediately. I let the sentence complete itself in the room. Then Marcus told me something he had learned during the negotiations leading up to the agreement. Tiffany's attorneys had spent weeks reviewing the civil filing, the Beaumont documentation, the tenant contact, the vehicle issue, the recorded communications, and the Secretary of State filing. They had concluded that her exposure was significantly greater than she initially believed. What began as a civil problem had developed into something with consequences she could no longer assume would remain limited to civil court. Only then did Marcus explain the agreement itself. Tiffany had given the AG's office a full statement naming Franklin as the primary architect, the fraudulent Secretary of State filing conceived and executed by Franklin, the expired power of attorney deployed against my accounts at Franklin's direction, the systematic campaign to undermine my professional standing conducted through Franklin's direct contact with Lewis's business associates, the coordination with Desmond through the Hargrove and Associates Property Company, dates, communications, documented correspondence between them that established not just what had been done, but when the planning began and who had directed each move. She had been thorough, the kind of thorough that comes not from conscience, but from calculation. From a person who has looked at the full weight of what is bearing down on them and determined that the most efficient path through it requires giving the other person to the people asking questions. She had done the arithmetic. Franklin was the cost of her exit. She paid it without hesitation. Franklin's attorney received notice of the cooperation agreement the same morning it was executed. Marcus didn't know Franklin's precise reaction. Attorneys don't share that. But Franklin's attorney had requested an emergency meeting with the AG's office before noon, which told its own story. An emergency meeting request from a defense attorney the same morning, his client's co-conspirator executes a cooperation agreement, is not the sound of a strategy holding. It is the sound of a strategy understanding, for the first time, that it has already failed. I thought about the architecture of what Tiffany had just done. She had identified her exposure. She had identified the exit. She had walked through it and closed it behind her with documentation that buried the man she had built the scheme beside. She had done to Franklin precisely what the two of them had done to everyone else, located the most valuable thing available to her in a difficult situation and taken it cleanly, without sentiment, without hesitation, without a backward glance. This was not poetic justice. Poetic justice implies that something larger and wiser arranged the outcome. This was simply Tiffany being, completely and finally, herself. The same person she had always been, applying the same methodology she had always applied. The only difference was the direction it was aimed. Then Marcus told me about the third property. Tiffany's statement had referenced a Brown and Associates holding that my team had not yet documented. A property Franklin had been negotiating separately, without my knowledge, with a prospective buyer he had contacted through one of Lewis's pulled-back business associates. The negotiation had not completed, but it had begun, and it was now part of both the civil matter and the inquiry, added to the picture by the woman Franklin had trusted most. He had been reaching further than I knew. I sat with that, not with shock, with recognition. A man who had spent 11 months being careful and patient and methodical would not have stopped at what was visible. Of course, there was more. There was always more with a person who believed the entirety of what Lewis built was simply waiting to be collected. I asked Marcus what came next for Franklin. He said the AG's office would make that determination. But the cooperation agreement alongside the civil filing, the recorded call, Gerald's documentation, the Secretary of State evidence, and now Tiffany's full statement, the picture was complete, and it was clear. I said, Lewis always said, the truth doesn't need help. It just needs time. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then he said, he was right. The black SUV was back in its space. I noticed it the way you notice something that has been returned to where it belongs, not with relief, not with ceremony, just with the quiet acknowledgement of a thing restored to its correct position. The civil proceedings had handled the vehicle log. Marcus's office had handled the transfer documentation. The space in the Brown and Associates garage that had been empty when I came home from the hospital was full again, and I gave it one look and walked past it toward the building entrance. Some things don't require more than that. I took the elevator to the management suite on the 4th floor, the one Lewis had designed himself, the layout his idea, the window placement deliberate so that anyone sitting at the main desk would have the Houston skyline directly behind them when they faced the room. He said it reminded him of what the work was for. I had always understood what he meant, but never said it back to him. I wished now that I had. His office was exactly as he left it. I had kept it that way, not out of grief, though grief had been part of it, but because the room worked. Everything in it was placed with intention, and the intention was still sound. I sat at his desk and opened the folder Marcus had sent over. A leasing inquiry for the 3rd floor space, vacant since Lewis died. The one I hadn't had the bandwidth to properly market while everything else was happening. The prospective tenant was a small architectural firm, 8 years in business, clean financials, strong references, the kind of operation that treats a leased space like it matters. The kind of tenant Lewis would have approved within the first 5 minutes of reviewing their package. I read the inquiry twice. Then I signed the authorization to proceed and placed it in the outbox for Marcus's office. Brown and Associates was still in business. It would continue to be. I sat back and looked at the room. The filing cabinets Lewis had organized by year. The framed site photographs on the wall. Every groundbreaking from 1991 forward. 30 years of foundations laid and buildings raised. The cornerstone photograph from this very building, 1998. Lewis, in a hard hat, holding a shovel he'd brought from home because he didn't trust the ceremonial ones to feel real enough. Franklin had mistaken the name for the inheritance. He had looked at Brown and Associates and seen an asset to be transferred, a thing with a value that could be moved from one column to another. He never understood that the name was the result of the work, not the other way around. You couldn't inherit the name by taking the building. The name lived in the decisions, the relationships, the 31 years of showing up and doing it correctly. It lived in Mrs. Okafor calling me because 9 years of honest landlord work had made her trust my number more than a stranger's. It lived in Marcus already having sent the AG referral because Lewis had chosen him carefully enough that anticipating the right move was simply how he operated. Franklin could not have taken that. It was never transferable. I pulled open the bottom desk drawer to find a pen for the outbox label, and I saw it. A folded piece of paper pushed to the very back, not in any folder, not organized, just there. The paper had yellowed at the edges the way paper does when it has lived in a drawer for years without being disturbed. I unfolded it carefully. Lewis's handwriting. Older ink, slightly faded. It said, "You always knew what to do." I just tried to keep up. I didn't know when he had written it. I didn't need to know. I folded it along its original crease and put it in my jacket pocket against my chest. I stood at the window. Houston spread out behind the glass the way it always had. Indifferent, busy, unbothered by what happens to any one person inside it. But Lewis's name was on the directory downstairs. His work was in these walls. His judgment was in the operating agreement that had stopped his son from taking what was never his to take. I talked to him the way you talk to someone who already knows what you're going to say, but needs to hear you say it anyway. I told him about the 57 calls, and Celestine's folder, and Marcus's office, and a man in Beaumont named Gerald Hargrove, who had finally put something down that was too heavy to keep carrying. I told him what Tiffany had done in the end and how she had done it. I told him Franklin was in the hands of people whose job it was to handle such things, and that I had done everything I could do, and it had been enough. I told him the building was all right. I told him I was all right. I did not forgive Franklin standing at that window. Forgiveness belongs to people who have seen themselves clearly and chosen differently. What I did was release the weight of him. Set it down the way you set down something that was never yours to carry in the first place, once you finally understand that it was never yours. I had seen clearly. I had responded fully. I was finished. I picked up my keys. I turned off Lewis's office light. I took the stairs.